So Leanne and I met at Northeastern. Leanne Tchaikovsky is at Northeastern University. She specializes in, I guess, what I would call serious games, but in any case, virtual reality games. I met her when she was talking and working on a project on autism and virtual reality games that, I don't know, help diagnose or
No, more just to really understand behavior in a natural setting.
for two people
Yep,
and how autistic people differ from the ordinary people in completing a game. Oh, this is there was a promise of a prize for the best project, and this is actually this is the best game console in the world, and there will be no arguments about that. I have one and I love it, and there will be games to go along with it too. Anyway, so I met Leanne a couple of years ago at AAAI conference. That's American Association for the Advancement of Intelligence. I don't know, which was held at Northeastern University, and we've been kind of colleagues ever since. My friend Sauce introduced us, and today she's filling out some area that I don't think, if I'm not mistaken, we have not touched on, which is esports. And esports are like a really big thing for PlayStation, but also just in the gaming community in general. I have a son who literally spends hours watching people play video games in various contexts. So, this is not a small thing. And also, I don't know that we've talked very much about eye tracking. But the PSVR 2, which is the latest version of our virtual reality headset, has eye tracking in it, and this is like if you ever get a chance, get a Tobii eye tracker for a couple $100. Plug it into your computer. You can do all kinds of fun things with it. So that's from the point of view of somebody who knows almost nothing. So I'm going to just turn it over to Leanne and let her give you the real story. So let me say thank you, Leanne, for coming here today.
Thank you, Stopa. I appreciate the introduction, and thank you all for coming. Hopefully by the end of this, you will feel comfortable. If you're really interested in that Tobii eye tracker, I've got buckets of them. I'll explain why. So hit me up, and I can connect you with one, and you can try it out. Okay, so we don't have to talk about me having a weird journey and being a neuroscientist who found her way into games, but you'll hear a little bit about that along the path. So I'm really interested in the eSport Rocket League, largely because some of my development outside of academia had to do with sitting alongside of a soccer pitch, watching little kids initially really not play soccer very well, and then as they develop, actually connecting passes and showing what we're going to call game vision. Now, this is a pro match, but like you can see when they actually know where the play ought to be, right? They know where the person they're targeting, and they know something about that other person and how they run or how they prefer to receive a pass. And so that connection, ironically, is something that I have been trying to study in the lab, albeit with virtual reality and two people, because I'm looking at movement and cognition between two people. This is kind of the dream, studying this, but it's really tough to do because you have to instrument all these people who would really rather not be encumbered by your eye tracking glasses and your heart rate monitor and all the other things you want to put on them. So that is a challenge, but we're trying to approximate it in other ways. Now, soccer is really interesting, but it's emblematic of a lot of different dynamic sports where there's really a high demand to pay attention to multiple targets that are moving. And so this is a situation, and it's from an article from Jocelyn Faubert's group a little over a decade ago. Jocelyn's done some really cool work in this space, which I'll tell you about. And so you can see the goalkeeper up there highlighted, and he's watching that ball. But he's also watching all these other people who are going to try to get at that ball and keep him from capturing that ball, right? So, nope. And why? Oh, okay, this is a video. At least it was a video. I'm not sure why it's not wanting to play now. It's claiming I have a network issue. So let me, is it actually streaming from? I thought it was embedded. That's a shame. So I'm going to be telling you about what's called a multiple object tracking task. And this is something that Jocelyn Faubert, on that last slide I was showing you, there we go, has published on. And he has been basically showing that in this incredibly reduced laboratory environment, I can take a bunch of little dots and move them around a screen and highlight some key dots and say, hey, I want you to track this blue one or these multiple blue ones. And then as the dots move around, I'm going to take away the color, and you're supposed to continue tracking those dots as everything's moving around. And then at the end, as they stop, I'm going to ask you if the dot that I've highlighted is one of those blue dots. It might sound simple. It is not. And let's see if now we can. So I feel like I'm back on campus because, as I made a joke when I came in today, that you never quite know what's going to happen when you go into the room that you're supposed to teach in that day. And so same here. Okay. There we go. So this is the multiple object tracking task, which you've all been ruminating, of course, in the last minute while we were trying to do this. So we're going to have those blue dots. The highlighted dot is the target. So keep that in mind when you say track it. It's kind of with your mind's eye. Look at that cross. There was a blue dot, and it's moving around. Keep it in your mind's eye. Okay, was that the right dot? No. Ha, very good. Okay, nicely done. All right, now we're going to make it a little harder. We're going to highlight a bunch of blue dots. Okay, was that a blue dot? Yes. Oh, look at you. I'm impressed with the crowd at MIT. Nicely done. Okay, so that is an example of multiple object tracking. And although I'm, of course I'm impressed with our wonderful audience, I have to tell you that pro sports players do this better because those dots could move a whole lot faster. And when they go faster, it is much harder. Not surprisingly, there are more collisions, there's more occlusions. And so this slide is showing you a bunch of different pro players from hockey, from rugby and soccer, from that same paper I was telling you about before, who were trained over multiple sessions, a number of sessions along the x-axis, to practice this multiple object tracking task. And the reason why they're doing this is because all of these sports have that same kind of game vision. I need to manage my attention in this space the way I was telling you about in the first slides. And so you can see that people get better. Their speed thresholds, the point at which they start to fail, generally it's like 75% correct, is much, much, much higher after they've been playing for a long time. Oddly, players who are sitting, maybe it's not that odd, players who are sitting perform a lot better than players who are standing. It's this extra challenge for your attention system to regulate, even in pro athletes, to regulate your body, and it takes away from your ability to focus on this task. Interesting. So they're training these people because there's some belief that your ability to perform multiple object tracking transfers to skill. And I'm going to highlight my my colleague Neil, who is a co-op student in our lab right now, who is actually a D1 soccer player at Northeastern and studying Rocket League. We'll talk at the end what Becky and Neil are doing in this task. So we've chosen Rocket League because it goes back and forth. I think it's sort of right in that middle of this, in a seesaw balance between the thing that I'd really love to measure in the real world, all these people running around, and a bunch of red dots on the screen, right? Which is not quite what I'm looking for, although it has the same fundamental principles. Rocket League, one place seated. I can actually track your gaze, which I really want to do because that's one of the things I've been doing for all of my career is track eye movements. It tells us a lot about attention. And there's a lot of really interesting scenarios and complexities that emerge in the game. So I don't know that I need to do this in this crowd, right? But we all know that is an e-sport, multi-million-dollar sport. It's effectively arena soccer played with rocket-powered cars, if you don't know. There are no, however, set player positions. You don't do any throw-ins. It's basically an arena. And teamwork is actually really kind of important. It's not the sort of game where like one player is just like trying to make all the shots. You really need to rely on your other teammates as you would in a sport like soccer, for example. Okay, so here's just an image. Actually, nope, this is also a video, but this is embedded, of the game. You play as the orange team. So your cars are always orange, and your players are highlighted with those orange labels. What I'm showing you in this gray circle is gaze overlaid during play. And you can see that sometimes looking at the ball, looking at your own car, sometimes you're looking between them, sometimes you're looking at other things. But it's really quite dynamic. And as we look at gaze behavior in this space, so there's an example of really looking in between things, looking at the ball. We really want to know not just how people, generally speaking, look at it, but how do people who are completely new look at play, and then how are people who are experts, because we have those, right? It's an e-sport, so we have people who are diamond ranked and above. That's generally what the line we set for our study. And so here's another quick video after a score. You'll see that for those of you who play, that we're playing in ball cam mode and not car mode. There's a reason for that. We can talk about that later. You can switch the camera angle, and I think that this is something that is of real interest to one of our guests in the room, Jen. And for eye tracking purposes, this is what we're interested in because we're interested in the targets and the car and the position that you're choosing in between these spaces. So let this video play out. And these are just to give you some examples of play. And this was one of our master students on the project, Ashwini. So what we did, and this was actually right around the time I was meeting Stopa in 2023, we presented this at the meeting that we were just talking about at Northeastern. And what we did is identified all the objects in the scene using a computer vision model. At the time it was the YOLO V7 model, so that we can actually track gaze and know what these objects were, right? And so this is just a little slide telling you how to do this. And then 2 years later, at an eye tracking conference, we presented a sort of more full explanation of that. We are still working on this project because there's many, many layers to it. Here's just some pictures of what the objects look like. So this is, to be clear, not just a, hey, let's run this, many, many, many videos through the YOLO V7 and magically you're going to have a bunch of objects detected. Nope. It was mostly Ashwini with some help of some other master students at the time. There was a lot of labeling, like, yes, that is a correct object. No, that is not a correct object. And initially in our first run, they were able to label a bunch of different objects, but not the goal. My lovely students tried to tell me that it wasn't important. I said, nope, it is soccer effectively, it is very important. But the goal, you can imagine, it's tough because it changes shape depending how you're looking at it. We were able to get it later as we got a little more familiar with this processing algorithm. So just some more examples of these different targets. And sometimes, as in this over here, they're like really like overlaying each other. So it gets rather complex. For those of you who are interested in object recognition, I put up these two slides because they tell you, this is the precision recall chart to say that we're doing a really good job with most of these objects, detecting them. And then a confusion matrix to show precision, basically. Okay, so experimental flow. In the data that I'm going to show you today, we played with an Xbox controller, not this keyboard. We played 3v3 with, I know, AI bots. But we really needed some control over what was happening here in the team, and so we couldn't really have it be against another player at this point. So all participants were given a practice tutorial, and then they had a 2.5-minute round 3 times. First with easy bots, second with medium bots, and the third with hard bots. And we had 2 groups of people that we recruited, people who were novice and people who were experts. And I would say that because this was like an early kind of pilot project, we didn't really know what we would even see. If I were to do it again, and we are doing it again, we'd probably put a little more space between the novices and the experts, because some of them had game experiences. It wasn't like they never picked up a controller before, but some people were like really noob, right? And so that meant that they were like maybe in a really different category. I'd like to keep the not experts of like, I've not played for more than 3 hours maybe, or I barely played and I don't have a ton of game experience, versus the experts who are diamond rank or above, okay? And those are 17 volunteers total. We had 7 experts and 10 novices. So I'm just going to show you some like first blush, like what did the data look like when we first got it out, because it was a mess, right? We get lots and lots and lots of gaze data when you do this. So just first look, like I'm just throwing some samples on the screen. If I'm looking at where you were looking on the monitor, by and large, novices looked largely at the center. There's a big center blob. And they're often looking at themselves, their own car. Experts also spend a lot of time in the center, but their center is like a little bit bigger. And they look at themselves, but they also look a lot at the ball. And they look at the ball in a very structured way. And they also looked at the boost a lot more. That's not surprising. They looked at the goalposts too. Side by side, you can see that these do look very different, right? So there's much more of a structured pattern. We have yet to really dig into this structured pattern because we got pulled into another finding. But first I wanted to show you a little bit about gaze duration. So this is looking at the different potential things that one could look at and how the time spent looking at those differs between experts and beginners. So experts look a lot more at the ball. This is the big change here. Beginners look a lot more at their own car. Experts look a lot more at the ball. That has persisted in various ways, and we went to look at it. Silly little graph, but transfer time, which I'm going to show you broken out by between objects, but it, not surprisingly, takes novices longer to shift between 2 things. And when I say longer, I'm talking about milliseconds, like, you know, about not quite 100 milliseconds more to shift between 2 things, right? But that matters in this really high skill cap fast game. So here that is broken out, right? So beginners take more on average in each of these. So we're not really seeing anything like, there's trends here, but it's interesting. So the self-opponent, I think there's the biggest difference here. Beginners look a lot more at the other opponents where the experts don't seem to. So this was interesting. I'm just gonna put this up here and tell you, like, this was a pause point. We're like, wow. As someone who's been studying gaze behavior for more than 2 decades, I was blown away by what I was seeing, even in the videos, because I don't believe that we have demonstrated in this dynamic of a setting the kind of gaze behavior where you're really looking in between things consistently and strategically switching to another target. And I want to know when people do it, why do they do it, and then can we train people who don't do it to do it when they're supposed to, right? That would be bringing in the coaches to that. So this is just telling you what we did and where we are. But here, I'm showing you just some examples. So this is an example of, oh yes, please.
I know this study is about rocketry,
yeah.
But are there genres of games you cover across the board for gaze behavior and gaze tracking? Or do you think, you know, even if you cover a wide variety of games, do you think gaze tracking is more effective in certain genres, such as similar to the ones that you're showing, which is sports?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. I would say that in my lab, this is the first game where we've made a lot of effort to track gaze and to really parse it. But I teach at Northeastern a class called Biometrics of Design, and one of the 3 areas that we focus on is eye tracking, and these are game science and design students. So they have tracked gaze on a lot of different kinds of games. And you know, the goals are sometimes different. Some of them are really user experience interested, so they're looking to see when you would look, say, at a map, or when you look at like any UI information. And I think that that's really interesting. Like, so Masa here is a PhD student and is looking at aspects of cognitive load, right? So can we actually read out from a game or other kind of complex environment how well someone's understanding the situation by the pattern of gaze or how often they check at a particular thing? So that's a great question. Right, I'm excited to do a bunch of other kinds of games, but right now I'm focused on Rocket League. Yeah, thank you. Okay, so this still image is an example of the green dot on top of self, your own car, right? And we see a lot of this. I would say this is a target look is what we're calling it. But this is a look that, if you want to, you could see, well, it's either between your own car and the ball and the goal, or your own car, the ball, the goal, and a teammate named Chopper. And that highlights part of the problem. If you are not looking at the target, what is it you're looking at? And we were able to characterize that when we're looking at an object or a target, beginners look at it about 25% of the time. Experts look at a target about 40% of the time. But by and large, most of the gaze behavior is at nothing. It can't be nothing. That's very inefficient. So what is it? And again, I was very drawn toward this. When we were first finding this, I had that master's student, Ashwini, come to me and said, "Professor, we have a problem." It's like, what's going on? I prefer to be called Leanne, but for whatever reason, most of my Indian students refuse to call me Leanne. They call me Professor. So Ashwini and she's afraid she's done something wrong. And she's like, "They're looking at nothing." I was like, "Show me." And I was like, "Actually, this is beautiful because they're not looking at anything. They're tracking the centroid of several different objects. And sometimes you even see when objects peel off, they track this other collection of objects, and this is happening super quickly. This computation is ongoing, and weirdly, beginners seem to do it just as often. Maybe not as well, but they're doing it a lot. This seems to be just a behavior we can do and we haven't characterized. So here's just another example of those 2 scenarios, target looking with 2 things mentioned, and we use those bounding boxes to determine, are we actually calling it target looking or center looking? And so here is an example of how we might calculate the centroid between multiple objects and that actual centroid position and see how far the gaze position moves off of this. Now, we spent a lot of time and looked for a lot of different ways to calculate this. I managed to not convince my student because he wanted to graduate, and he was awesome, and he should have graduated. This was his second project. He had another whole thing that he wanted to find a way that did not involve human coding all of these frames because he's like, "Oh, hell no." I was like, well, okay, that is the right way to do it, though. Like, that's really, really what needs to be done at some point. But we found another way, because you have to somehow get a sort of ground truth estimate of what is really going on the screen. And one of the things that influenced us was some older work. So I was showing you about multiple object tracking task from Faubert and colleagues. And this is from Fade and Seifert and colleagues in 2010, around the same time, in the heyday of multiple object tracking. And so this is showing on the left, tracking accuracy as a function of speed. As I told you, as the balls go faster, you get less good. But what I'm showing on the right is this finding that people tracking the center, that they're just looking at the overlap of gaze between these different things. So they're looking at the center of a bunch of things versus looking at the target. So that's the center is in red, the targets are in blue, and the distractors are in black. And so even early on, we got the impression that actually a lot of people are looking at the center, but they didn't really like nail it or how that's happening. And because multiple object tracking tasks, there was really no reason to pick one thing over another. They weren't individuated. There's nothing special about one red dot over another, unless you think one of them is a target. So there's not that draw to look at target versus centroid. But in their paper, they did show this idea, and they also wanted to expressly train people to shift between target and center versus just looking at target, which is kind of cool. So again, this is in that balance between lab and real world soccer. We're all lab here, right? This is the boring red dots. But this has happened where they've actually forced people to switch between target and center and just look at targets, and they were able to do it, right? So people had a harder time tracking just the target. So they had these 2 sessions where you're free to look wherever you want, and the accuracy in identifying the targets was higher. When they were forced to look at just the targets, they were less accurate, which is an interesting finding and kind of helps us interpret a little bit our own data, like why the beginners are even not looking at the target. It's just moving too fast, right? The center target switching folks did almost as well as the free looking behavior. So, and you can see that the percent of time, the gaze overlap time, whether they're looking at targets, distractors, or the center, you see in the center target switching condition, they're spending a whole lot more time looking at the center. So there's some idea, some evidence in the past from lab experiments that this isn't silly. This isn't like a ridiculous thing that people might do. It's just that we've never seen it in this incredibly fast dynamic where you're reassessing which targets are you looking at the center of. Okay, and just that was another example. You've seen that one before. So again, one of our first inclinations was to just do some basic, like, okay, what does this look like when we're plotting these? But what we were seeing is a lot of big difference between object looking and not object looking. We weren't getting differences in the what we're calling center looking, but we disagreed about how to do that. And so we found in the literature this really cool idea. It's called a competition analysis. And this slide is really complex, but I'm going to walk you through it a little bit. So basically what we're doing is calculating the distance of where you're looking to other potential objects. And then in every frame, there's a winner. It's either the, there might be no winner, but the gray strategy is either the combo. You're looking at a combination of things, we call it CGP, center gaze position, or you're looking at the target, right? So center looking, this CGP should be center looking as well, or target looking, right? So for each one, we're doing this little calculation and saying like, okay, the gaze moved in this direction, and that is toward a target or toward a center. And so this too was an intense calculation, but it was less human intense and more just like a lot of churning through computer time and frames, but it got us to a great result that seemed to hold up in multiple iterations when we held out some trials and we looked at them in a different way. And that is that the experts spent more time in target looking than the beginners, and over the different difficulties, we actually see a difference when we get to the hardest condition. The experts kind of pull down a little bit, right? And what's also interesting is that this is the first time, because we have this very reasoned, is it target? Is it the true centroid of different objects. And remember, it could be, if there's multiple things in the frame, it could be 1, 2, 3, 5 objects, right, that you're calculating between and seeing which is the winner. So we can actually also believe that we have an other category, right? And there was no difference in other. But we do see that the experts are doing a little less center looking, a little more target looking, but there seems to be a drop in the target looking when things get hard. Okay, that was a lot of work to get there, but there's so much more under the hood. And I have a bunch of students who are like, we really want to play with machine learning AI tools with this, and we want to see if we can predict what the players will be doing next, right? As I'm sure all of you are aware, like if you want to get a job in computer science, you'd better be fairly conversant with these kinds of things. And so one of my PhD and then postdocs, a student postdoc fellow, Min-Shin Cheng, led this modeling exercise. And she basically decided that there was going to be sort of two kinds of attention coming into play. So it was a classic like CNN with a long short-term memory module and these different kinds of attention. And then what we were able to see was that there, and she trained, just for starters, and this took a while, 6 and 6. So remember, we only had 7 experts. So she kept one out for testing purposes. But 6 experts and 6 novices. And then look to see what's different in their behavior. And then we're later playing some prediction games. So if she's looking at this average attention weight from the model, we can look at temporal aspects of attention. We can look at spatial aspects of attention. One of the things that's really interesting is that the experts are much flatter. They're integrating over a much longer time horizon than the beginners. The beginners have a bias for whatever happened on that last frame, right? So there's this real peak here, yeah? And that is consistent whether you're talking easy, medium, hard. So that's a really interesting result, right? They are just they're just not looking over the history of what has come before. And in some ways that makes sense, right? If you're just learning this, you don't necessarily know what these things are. And in fact, I was speaking with someone yesterday who does a lot of work. We've written a grant together on this work, and she does a lot of work with esports coaches. And again, going back and forth between the real world of sports and coaches, they were having a hard time explaining the thing that they're looking for. Like, you can have the skills and be really fast with the controller. But one of the things that people in like soccer or hockey, they're looking for excellent executive function skills in youth elite players. And executive function skills, include dynamic attention and working memory. But what the literature also says, and I think that this more to this point, is that there's some anticipatory skill that actually is really related to like striking sports, like tennis. And it's when, when something is about to happen, how good are you at predicting what exactly is going to happen? So if it's in tennis, it's the spin of the ball coming at you. And I know somebody's really interested in golf, yes. So same too, though, in soccer and here in Rocket League. Like, how can these last several frames condition what you expect to happen like in the next frame or two? And that's one of the things this model is really good at helping us think about. We also could use this to look at the weight of attention on the left, your left, the attention weight for the different objects, and see that the experts spend, much as we saw when we looked at the raw data, a whole lot more time looking at the ball category. They also look more at the boost category, also not surprising when you realize what that boost will do for your gameplay, right? They don't look so much at the goal. I think they just know where the goal is, right? They know that they have to get it in that direction, where the beginners look a lot more at the goal, right? We also had some interesting differences in this concept of entropy, so like sort of randomness in gaze behavior, right? And depending upon, so if you've played Rocket League, there are times when there's like a real jumble of people mixed up. And if you've played soccer, you know that can happen right in front of the goal too. And it's like, absolute chaos. And so when there's high opponent density, there's not really much difference, although the claim from statistics is that it is significant, but it doesn't appear to be incredibly different in terms of the amount of entropy, but there's a lot more variability. The beginners show how much higher entropy when there's no ball present. They're searching for what to do, basically, right? And when the situation is sparse, it looks a lot more like the no ball present in the frame. So I think this method is helping us really get a little more nuance into what is going on in each of these frames. How can we use these data to predict behavior? How can we use these insights to help with what I think, where's the impact on this? Like, how can we help people get better, right? Coaching. How can we use gaze behavior, something that is typically invisible, right, to help people play better? Can we make it available to individuals? Can we actually work together with coaches to understand what are they telling people? These people are experts. They know how to improve players. They've done it over multiple times. What are they saying, and how do we relate that back to the gaze behavior that we're seeing in order to try to get some of that same goodness? Yeah? Okay. I'm going to shift gears just a little bit and was wondering if you had any questions. Yes?
Well, I had a question about visual clutter that can show up when players want to customize their vehicle for different colors that make it slightly different than blue and orange, or the boost color paths that have very flashy contrails. And is that a distraction for beginners versus the more?
That is a great question. It would almost certainly be a distraction for both, particularly if things are flashing or what have you. I don't have data to share with you because when you go training a object recognition model, you don't want to change any of that. You would really like those things you invested many, many hours in training to be the same. And so one of the things I think we need to do is go and see how robust they are, and can we actually play with some of those things, and can we top them up with a little bit more training to see? Because I think that is a good question, and I'll get to some attention training games that I built that suggest that particularly when you're a beginner or you've got weak attention skills, those things can really distract you. As long as you have that top-down task, you understand what you're trying to do, you have reasonably strong attention filtering skills, then you can probably get rid of those things and dial in. But it also could be the case that when you're a real expert and you're used to playing a certain way, that these things could really derail you for a while. You'll probably recover more quickly, though. It's the best answer I've got. Yeah? Okay. So for something a wee bit different, but related, all of this was about measuring gaze unobtrusively while you're playing. That's great. People don't necessarily want their game changed, right? They just want to be able to use this to know more about their play and to drive, potentially better performance later. So I'm going to call that passive versus active eye tracking, which is what I did in a suite of games that was part of an NIH study starting in 2012. And then we launched a small startup called BrainLeap Technologies in 2017. And it was to make games using that eye tracker that Stopa was telling you about. That's what the Tobii eye tracker looks like. It's this tiny little bar, sits at the bottom of your monitor, not really a big deal, and it can just track your gaze. So this is Julia, who's now alarmingly in college, playing a suite of games while she's not touching anything, and driving a little spaceship through some gates. And so the goal of this was to take kids. Our NIH grant was specifically working with kids on the autism spectrum disorder, on the autism spectrum who had particular differences in attention, particularly challenges sort of letting go of attention and slow shifts to engage specific things. So we were trying to see if we can use the eyes as a bit of a harness to help train their attention. And so I'm going to show you some games. So this is like just a classic whack-a-mole game. The circle is my gaze while playing. And so your job is to hit the moles, but not that mole. That's a Dr. Mole, Professor Mole. We don't hit professors, right? Yeah, so there's another one of those. So you have to ignore that. And that demand to go to it, nope, don't go to it. That is executive function. That's switching between a drive to go to inhibit. This is a much different task. You're looking for these mushrooms and you're steadily fixating. You got to steady, steady, steady. Children with some attention challenges often have a challenge with steady, steady fixation. So this is that space race game I was telling you about. Your job is to get through the gates, which start bigger and then get smaller. And if you can possibly get those stars along the way, great. But they're sometimes in a bad spot, like there, that won't let you get them. So you have to make a really fast decision along the way to try to catch those. And this is tough. I had to learn how to play while talking to people and demonstrating it because we had to start it. And this is a game that is exclusively about inhibitory control. We use this game to unlock, to give kids like something fresh and interesting to do after they play a lot of other games. You have to not look at those shapes as best you can. Have you ever tried to like actively not look at things when there's a bunch of things around? It is hard. This is partly why we wanted to have this unlock last, right? So they had a lot of other experience in driving things with their gaze. So this was something that happened, again, for over 5 years. We had NSF SBIR funding, phase 1, phase 2, phase 2B. I think our big challenge, and I would like to re-engage this maybe in some way, because I think that the time still hasn't hit. I'll explain in a minute. We tried to sell into schools because we believe that everyone should have access to this, right? Like it should just be available in schools for kids to train. And that, as it turns out, is a terrible business model. Absolutely, truly terrible. So it just wasn't something that we could get if we managed to sell into schools. Now we have to convince the teachers to get the kids to have the time to do it. You have to have IT at the school who's capable to integrate the eye tracker, the software. I mean, there were way too many moving parts to do this way. If I were to do it again, I would still hope to get this out to everyone. But I think I would probably start with something that does exist now but didn't exist when we started. There are actually specific attention training centers for kids who need skill and use this as training and then get some top up that is more specifically like related to the kind of homework that they're doing. So you could build some bridges, some scaffolds to everyday life. So that was a little like small step into gaze contingent or active eye tracking. But now we get back into something that's probably more interest to folks in the room, which is, well, if eye trackers are ubiquitously available, which that's becoming true, they're in our VR headsets like the PSVR 2, how can we use them to actually make our games better? I showed this slide and a couple of related slides to a group that was visiting campus from Epic, right? Because that's something that they're specifically interested in too. How can we use gaze in order to make our characters recognize that we're looking at them? You've all felt when someone's looking at you and you turn around and it's like, oh, like there's that sense of presence that comes with gaze behavior, right? That recognition. So even though it's not two people in the room together, like how can we actually use gaze to get these subtle social behavioral hints? And so one of the things that I'm doing, didn't get the slide, but I'm working with colleagues. This is an example from Stacy Marcella and his work on empathic, but we have a much less pretty virtual patient. So Stacy makes a lot of virtual humans, and particularly with very subtle expressions. And we're working together on a prototype VR system that we published on. The lead author is Eileen McGivney, and she is interested in education and VR. And so we're working with the Bouvet College of Health Sciences and several really talented faculty to help us figure out how we can use these virtual patients in VR, along with some AI models, to help students get experience with difficult clinical conversations. This is also where eye tracking comes in, right? But it's not just eye tracking. So eye tracking is important. You need to be able to look at the virtual patient while you're saying something to them. If you've ever had a doctor look over here while they're giving you some sort of nasty diagnosis, it doesn't feel good. No, we don't want that. So we want to train our students to do this. So they're verbally responding to the patient, and the patient is responding to them. But we can also make the patient have facial expressions. We can also pick up on the facial expressions of the student, right? So the patient can leak information. I'm feeling fine. Well, maybe not, you know, but the student needs to also manage their own facial expression and gaze behavior so that the patient, virtual in this case, doesn't pick up on like a, oh, okay, like whatever, you know, slightly dismissive facial expression you just made. That's not going to help the conversation, right? So there's spaces in which we can do this thing. I'm going back and forth between how this is useful in games and how it is useful in other realms, like preparing future clinicians. But I think, yeah, and those of you who've looked at Fortnite and their AI character, Darth Vader, I was like, well, nice choice, because Darth Vader isn't very emotive, right? So, you know, but if we really want to have our characters be extremely expressive, then we need to use this behavioral response prediction in order to, and gaze behavior being part of that, in order to create these characters that are more expressive, right? So facial actions actually are available. It's actually, you know, feasible in a lot of VR headsets, but it is a little bit harder than gaze at this moment. Okay, so I've told you a lot of things, specifically about Rocket League, but also how I see gaze behavior being really relevant toward the future of really immersive games and particularly character behavior. I'm also obviously really interested in using it for health purposes, both for training individuals with attention challenges, but also for training our future health people. So I just want to highlight a couple folks. I didn't bring my laser pointer, but the person who did a whole lot of this work, Trent Simmons, is sitting midway back on my right side. And then Minshin, who is like two more down next to Sundar, also did a lot of this work. This was our celebration this summer when we were having a couple folks leave. Bojo here in the front was visiting here from Bern, and he's actually really interested in studying soccer and was involved in helping us out with ideas for the Rocket League study and its next steps. So with that, I'm happy to take any questions. Yeah, I think somebody wants to give you a mic.
Yeah, we should use the microphone. So.
Sorry if I missed it. Sorry if I missed it, but can we go back to the graph where there's an expert and beginners looking at different objects? Yeah, yes,
one?
this one,
Yep.
yes.
Yep.
So sorry if I missed it, but like, did you came to a conclusion why people, the two groups have a different gaze on like balls and goalposts?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, we can't really know why. I mean, we didn't go back and interview them, but the thing that kind of makes sense is that the boost is something that experts would look at because they understand how much it contributes to gameplay, right? Like you really want to find that boost because if you find it and go over it, right? Whereas the beginners, I don't think have as much of an understanding of the benefits of the boost, and particularly like the benefits of a boost at a very specific time. That whole aspect hasn't been touched yet. Like it's not just, I'm giving you averages of when people do, what people do. There are certain scenarios that I'd like to look at where it's like that when it would make a ton of sense to look at the boost, and that's something that we've talked about doing next. So I think that that's one answer for the boost. The goalpost, I mean, if you're really experienced in this space, you know where it is. And you might take a quick look, but you're probably not looking at it a lot. And so this is looking at attention weight. So it's like the relative weight. So it's a combination of time and like top category, right? And then with the ball, I guess I'm not surprised or unsurprised that experts look more at the ball. I would have thought that we'd see a lot more looking at, because we did before, looking at self, but it's equivalent from the beginner. So we do see beginners looking more at the teammates. Their teammates at something that they don't.
Yeah, because I did a long time ago. I think it was in Japan. They did a study on soccer players, and what they were doing is like they show a 3-second frame of a certain player's vision, and then they asked, and then they gave like a mini paper board of the game, and then say like how many players can you pinpoint where they were.
Oh, that's awesome.
And regular people are like, I don't know if there's a professional player for any of us, but like regular people like us can only pinpoint about at most 3 to 5 people. But professional players were able to pinpoint at least like 15 players.
Wow.
So I was like looking at that, like maybe experts, like the goalpost is already in their head, like kind of like what you mentioned, and like teammates are already in their head, so they don't need to look at them. While as the ball is the only variance of every single game, so they just need to look at the ball, and then like,
Yeah.
and then that's it's rolling in their head. While like beginners are like, they have no idea who is where, and like they have to look at this, that, and like.
Yes. Yeah. No, thank you for that. That's actually really interesting. So I'm not as familiar, and I don't know how this rolls out, but like plays in Rocket League, right? Like, but I'm sure they happen. It seems very chaotic, but there are some plays, and so experts will know about that too, just like there are in soccer. I didn't know about that soccer. You need to look that one up, right? A story about pinpointing where people are, and if you're a pro, that's definitely the case of if you get a snapshot of a chessboard, right? Experts in chess can tell you if it's a real game or not a real game. Yes. And like kind of like where the play is next. Yeah. So thank you.
Hi, I'm curious with your startup, did you find that there was any connection for when kids got better at playing those eye-gazing games to their school-related tasks, or was that still left to be investigated?
Thank you. We wouldn't have done the company if the early data didn't pan out, right? So yeah, it really did improve things. The thing that I don't think we ever really got to is to put a fine point on exactly who. What I believe I was seeing from the data that we had is that the kids who were, they're often called twice exceptional, right? So they've got relatively high IQs, but they also are dealing with some executive function challenges, attention, what have you, seem to benefit from this the most. So kids who just have like frank developmental disorders, a lot of intellectual disability, a lot of that, like they had slower progress in these things. But we had kids, and so there's a lot of reasons why kids don't read at reading level. And classically, we thought about all of that. We put it in a bucket of dyslexia. It is not all frank dyslexia. A lot of it is attention. I actually had one of those kids, right? And it was super frustrating because you knew the kid was like capable, clever. He's interested in like complex stories, but he's reading these like 3 words on a page, and you're like throwing the book across the room, like I hate this, right? So, but when you give him a book, like the Kindle helped because you can blow up the text and make it easier. But when you give him a book and he would try to read it, and he'd look at me and say, "Where am I?" How should I know where your eyes are? And actually, I do eye tracking. So he was actually very early on a part of this. And it was interesting because he'd already sort of moved over to the, like, I am now reading to learn. I'm not learning to read. But a lot of kids didn't. And we had 3 kids, which is just surprising to me. And one was like super prominent in our studies where they just took off because the games helped them get the attention skill so that they can actually read on their own independently. One kid was just, again, like really, really high IQ, super exceptional kid, but he would read encyclopedia entries, like very, very brief things, so he just couldn't like hold it together for long enough. And after playing, he read the Harry Potter series. And so like there's those kinds of things, in some ways, speak to me more than, yes, they improved on the classic attention tests. Yep, check. But one of the things that we don't talk about often is like, how much do those classic attention tests show what they can do in the world? And so it was like these kids that actually really improved their reading. And that was one of the outcomes we were looking at in schools. It's tough to get people to measure that, though. It's tough to get them to like, okay, and so I'd like your twice annual reading scores for the kids who took this, please, right? And so, but I think it's worth going back to. I think there's a lot of benefit potentially in that space. It's just hard to deliver. I told a couple people about this, and I'll never forget it. We had an advisor early on who asked us, like, so are you selling software or are you selling hardware? Because if you're selling software, you're a cat. If you're selling hardware, you're a dog. And you guys are cat dogs. I'm like, oh, man. It's like the kiss of death right there. I do not want to be a cat dog. But they weren't wrong, right? You need the Tobii eye tracker. And we had a contract with Tobii. You know, we had licensing and all these things. Like, you needed all these things to work together to get this going. I think we were way too early.
Thank you.
Somebody behind you. Yeah.
Thank you. So thanks for the talk. I had two questions. Like the first is, how did the coaching with these a gaze analysis and results went on? Like later you said that maybe this could be used to teach people that didn't do this, like beginners, to get an idea of how to get better by influencing their gaze behavior. I want to know if this was attempted and the feedbacks and the results. And the second thing is that I've played the game quite a while, and I have the feeling that your behavior with the gaze, especially on what you pay attention to, is very different if you're playing with and against bots, both in your team and against, and if you're playing with other players of basically your same level. I think there will be many differences with this thing, and maybe that data, even if though it's harder because unless you pick always the same opponent, then it's very difficult to, I don't know, play this online and try to find random opponents. Yep. But I believe the results will be different. So I'm quite curious to know if the findings of this gaze analysis with playing against and with bots were actually general enough, because for some for some aspects, I don't know, ball and the boost, I could find it okay. This could be even general when playing against bots. But for the others, I don't know. I'm very curious to know how was.
Thank you for that question. And that is really interesting, and it ties to something that we are interested in our larger research, which is how do people behave differently when they know that there's a social presence, even if you can't, here, social presence is represented by another car, right? So we have studies in the lab that Stopa was alluding to where people are in VR and they're doing a puzzle game, making a pattern here over here, solo, in a collaborative environment or in a competitive environment. And your other player in those competitive and collaborative environments looks like a ping pong ball, not emoting at all. You can kind of see them moving and head and nose, right? So you know what they're doing, sort of. But your behavior changed because they're there. You know they're there, right? And so I agree with you. We haven't done it because on that seesaw of experimental control, we went more on the experimental control side with the bots. But I think it is important, and I think it will change behavior, especially for experts. Yeah. So back to your first question, we have talked to some coaches. We haven't implemented anything yet. We have 2 coaches at Northeastern who are interested, and that is actually a big part of the grant that is currently under review. So if you know anyone at NSF, particularly in perception, action, cognition, you want to give them a little shout out that this is a good research, you want to do that. Yeah. I really don't have much else to say other than we've just taken the very first steps to think about that. But yeah, I think it's important. Thanks.
Thank you so much. My question's on real-time strategy games. If you have actually employed this technology or tracking or studies around RTS games, because as I can see from some of the graphs that you've showed, for expert players in this game or games like Rocket League, there's concentration of gaze, while in RTS games, it's actually more chaotic and frequently changing gazes, plus also broad strokes, which would resemble a beginner in games like Rocket League, right? So how do you track that, and how do you, effectively, if there are studies that you've done, look at evolving any learnings at all as we design better games?
Thank you for that. We haven't looked at any real-time strategy games or any of the other games yet, in part because even though this was difficult to do the object mapping, when the world gets really complex and there's like a ton of things, like what is it that you map? Like what objects can you get? And so your choices are twofold. Like you do what we did, and you do a whole lot of object detection and try to get reliable objects, or you get a game where you've got the guts of it and you can play with it. And so now if I'm dealing in Unity or Unreal or what have you, I could, I know where all the stuff is, right? And then I can look, and I think that latter strategy is much better for the kind of games that you're talking about. I don't have access to those, but this is something that is interesting and something we'd like to do, but you probably want to get some indie developer who's done something like this. So there's pros and cons. Like I've even had colleagues of mine we have a brain game center at Northeastern. They're like, why Rocket League? Why don't you just make your own? I'm like, sure. Why don't I just make my own? And I'll go get millions of people who play that little lab game too. Like, no, like there's something about Rocket League that is really unique. Like I can get people who have played hours and hours and hours and hours and have earned a diamond rank, and that's unique, right? I won't get that from my own lab-grown game. However, there are other questions that you might want to ask about something like a real-time strategy that are better done with either a lab-grown game or a game where someone's willing to give me access to the guts so I can track it. I hope that answers your question. Yeah.
Any other questions?
Yeah, up here. Oh. There's one more up here. Yeah.
Just this last one. Yeah. Okay.
I think this might be a tough question, but
I'm ready.
Could you use like gaze behavior as a metric to understand how well teammates communicate with each other? Because that's important in video games.
That. So that goes back kind of to your question, right? So maybe. So what's really interesting to me about this, and it's not something I've studied, but it's something I've thought about. We are communicating now. So we have eons of experience as humans looking at each other and connecting, and the look from mom, and so we have facial expressions, we have postures, we have all of this. But now with our last several decades of digital, where you are interfacing with something and your character is represented as something else, things are really different. So where people have studied some of this is, if you've heard of the Proteus effect, right? Like when you're embodying a character, you often take on but it's like a character, like a humanoid type character. You take on the characteristics of that character. So people have thought about things like that. And so as you're playing with other people who have those characters, I could see there it's a little more like you're looking for expression. You're looking to see how people engage there. With Rocket League, in some ways, it's more simple because the cars aren't making any expressions, right? But they are moving and they're doing certain things. So maybe that is a way. It's just a very different way to think about it, right? But yeah, we might want to examine how players, particularly, maybe the way I would scaffold it to try is take a bunch of people who have played together a lot, a team that has played together a lot, and then a bunch of people who are similarly skilled but have zero ability to play together. I don't know what my soccer playing student would say, but when you play together a lot, chances are you know what's what in terms of what to expect from people. And so maybe we would see that in gaze.
Yeah, and I guess to follow up, so the 3v3s that were being played, that was 3 teammates versus 3 bots. Is that correct?
It was no. So it was 3 bots on one team, and then you, 1 human, and you had 2
Okay.
other players.
Yeah, I'd be curious to see like if you had 3 teammates and then 3 bots. Like if your teammate is like, oh, watch like this guy on the right, like he's coming
yeah.
at you, and your like
Yeah.
gaze kind of shifts. That would be interesting.
Yeah,
to
no, I
like
think-
show effective communication.
So
but
I mean, all these questions about other games are super interesting to me, and depending on how my lab goes and if it grows in the direction where we get lots of students who want to do these kinds of things, absolutely. But given the investment in Rocket League, we're continuing with Rocket League for quite some time, right? But I think that these are interesting questions to ask with Rocket League. Yeah, thank you.
Mike, did you want to make announcements?
Okay, I'm last. So any other questions right now? Okay, so I have a technical question, then I have a couple other things. So and this is relates to what somebody's playing. Are the games who are the subjects who are playing Rocket League, are they playing a solitaire version of the game, or are there other people in the game when you're studying? And the main question is, do you track how many goals they get or what their score is while they're playing?
Yeah, thank you for that. So yeah, we do. It was kind of beside the point. The experts do better. So when I was saying we play against bots, right? You are the only human playing. So there's 3 bots on the opposite team, and you have 2 bot partners, right? And that is known. I mean, we're not faking this, right? It's not like, oh, in the other room there are 2 humans, right? And the experts know. The experts, when they come into the lab, they're super excited about getting paid to do an experiment on Rocket League, and then like, and you're going to be playing with bots, and they roll their eyes. They're like, oh boy, like. Great, yeah. So because it's just super easy for them. So the performance looks different for sure. Yeah, we do collect that data.
All right, so I have a couple announcements, but first, can we thank Leanne again for a great.
You're a wonderful audience. Thanks.